So here we are tonight, and everyone did it of, quote, free accord. So, we have talked about on our chart behind me and in your handout, all of these first tier levels. Now we're going to say, or talk about rather, what is this second tier? And we're also going to look at it in the way that I explain it from the biblical narrative to people that are in spiral dynamics but have nothing to do with religion, and to people that are in science and that have little to do with religion. Although I will tell you that the communities that I am a part of now, the people in science are more and more convinced of spirituality. And they really identify with spirituality as the source of this universe. And again, if you read the book Cosmic Hologram by Dr. Curvon, she goes over the quantum experiments that have been done just in the last 10 years. I'll mention one or two of them tonight when I'm drawing up here on the whiteboard, and we'll tie it into spiral dynamics, and we'll tie it into the biblical narrative. And it will become part of a big subject that's going on among so many from different fields, and that's the subject called convergence. That what we're seeing is that these are not separated fields. We talked about separation. In fact, I belong to a group called Evolutionary Leaders. There are 240 of them globally. And they're simply people that are trying to get together and collaborate to solve the problems that we have here on the planet. That's what they're looking to do. It's not something that's exclusive or anything by that by any means. It's people that say, I'd like to invest my time as a scientist or a business person in joining with other people of like mind in my field to start putting out podcasts or writing books and showing that the nature of this spiral dynamics, in essence, which they all appreciate, has really been heading us to a point in time where we're seeing less and less separation and more unity. And in fact, the 240 people that got together wrote something that they simply call a unitive narrative. And what's really cool is that unitive narrative sounds a whole lot like the trajectory of the biblical narratives I will go through with you. And I'm saying this to say that the biblical narrative, in my mind now, I'm convinced and very excited about, is so much bigger than a narrative that only applies to, what, maybe 25% of our planet? I mean, the way the narrative has been used for identity, if I say I am Christian, okay, then when I'm talking about identity, I'm talking about the fact that I have an identity that 3/4 of the world does not. So why would they be interested in my narrative? Those are questions we're talking to people about. Well, how else could it be? Well, let's look at that and talk about some things. The values of second tier is not that it's a whole new lens that you would add on top of postmodern as we got up here to postmodern. Rather, it is a way of objectively looking at all first tier levels and transforming them so that rather than being seen as separated eras, separated culture wars, separated this view against that view, that all of these views represent one unified trajectory, and that all levels have within them healthy values. And for the first time, people are saying, we are all levels. I'm archaic, I'm tribal, I'm warrior, You say warrior, now wait a minute, that was that bad news stuff you were talking, violence and killing. Well, in first tier, warrior is that way. But when we get to Jesus, and we're going to talk more about Christology tomorrow, when we get to Jesus, he's transforming all these levels. And we're going to see that tomorrow. So let's just take warrior as an example. Warriors, the red, it's all about shedding blood, other people's blood. Jesus in the garden, they're taking him away. Peter picks up his sword, tries to cut the guy's head off. He gets his ear. And Jesus says, no, put down the sword. Kingdom now is a whole different concept. And it's not of the world from which you come. It's a whole different concept of kingdom. And we'll talk about kingdom as we go along here too, because it has both a first tier as well as a second tier understanding. And so Jesus then, rather than a warrior who's out shedding blood like Attila the Hun, and I use those examples, for Jesus, he's a warrior for peace. He is the red badge of courage. He is the one who now has transformed what it means to be a warrior. And the same is going to be true of tribal, because in tribal, it was all genealogical. It's our biology. It's our biological tribe. That's the 12 tribes of Israel. And so you were either of Israel or you were Gentile. And that's identity. That's the way they saw identity. You are either of the 12 tribes or you are a Gentile. And so what did you have? Separation between Jew and Gentile. Man, when we get to the first century, there are a lot of problems that Paul encounters because he's sent to the Gentiles. And who does he come up against? Not just people within Judaism, but Jewish followers who are doing their best to go out to Galatia and other cities where Paul is and tell those people, yes, we're followers of Jesus, but you still need to be circumcised. They were Jewish followers. That's what they did in Jerusalem. Paul had to go to Jerusalem and have a conference, Acts 15, about whether the Gentiles should be circumcised. Peter, James, and John agree with Paul, and they say, look, this is a yoke we've had to bear forever. So what did they decide? The Gentiles are not to go backwards into circumcision as an identifier, a God identifier. God gave that circumcision practice to Abraham. But they did not say that they were going to have their Jewish followers cease to do that. We'll talk more about that as well. But what was happening was the inclusiveness, the breaking down the wall. Paul wrote to the people in Ephesus, he says, regarding Jew and Gentile, Jesus has taken down the wall of hostility so that we now are part of one new creation. Now we're getting into the nature of where we stand. We do not stand in a paradigm of separation. We stand in a paradigm of unity. Now, what's the source of that unity? I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So if I'm describing second tier, and we said transcend and include, okay. Everything in first tier, you see the colors of it. And so the question is, what color would we say is integral? And it is here that I said, we move from a difference of degree to a difference of kind. And so integral is really, the symbol for integral is light. Light includes all colors, yet itself is not a color. Now that's interesting. It includes all colors, but yet is not itself a color. Which is to say that what appeared to be separate culture war views as these came into being on the planet were actually just building block views of one single source of light. And that every single color of those worldviews belonged to light. They were all necessary. They all belonged. They weren't separate. They all had a role and function. Now, let's talk for a second. Let me, sorry video. Let me put my cane up. It makes it easier to stomp my feet and pound the podium. When the 40s, 50s, 60s came along, I told you how many people started noticing, hey, history seems to be developmental in nature, just like child development is obvious to us. And it's these worldviews, and they parse themselves out. Harvard psychologist Dr. Keegan came up with this phrase, and I'm going to parse this out for just a minute. And then it's going to get real exciting because I'm going to draw on the whiteboard. He said, the subject of one era, let's say worldview, is the object of the next. The subject of one worldview is the object of the next. What is he saying? He's saying that when you are in the fundamentalist worldview, that's the way it is. You're a subject of it. To say you're a subject of it means you're attached to that worldview. And what that means is that when you move into modernity and postmodernity, you're now able to look back on it objectively. You couldn't do that when you were in it. You were a subject of it. You couldn't critique it. You couldn't say, here's the healthy, unhealthy. I mean, that's the way that worked. This is moving into an integral concept where we become the observer. We are not subjects of all of the diversity that came before. Rather, that diversity plays a role and function. What is the role and function of each worldview? It brings about new values that address new complexity. So, in doing that, it allows for a constant reinterpretation of what we think is healthy, unhealthy. So now, when we're addressing law and order, if that's for me, please, I can't take it. We went through a stage where we saw there was corruption in the police department. I'll say that in general. And there was outrage over certain things that happened. One of the pushbacks was defund the police. Okay, that's basically saying, let's get rid of blue. You can't do that. Now you can try to get blue healthy, and that's what they're doing. There are people right now working in many precincts using these types of values, and they're training how to be better relationally to their community. Okay, that's an integral approach to blue. Defund it, get rid of it, that's a separation thing. You can't do that. And of course, people that said that initially thought differently if in fact someone was breaking into their house. So we see that what Keegan is saying is what Integral is saying, and that Integral is a recognition of all of these first worldviews. Now I'm going to bring up, and I will draw on the board here, I'm going to bring up a diagram. We're going to use it tonight, and I'm going to use it tomorrow to offer the future of faith and look at the biblical narrative in a new light. Just like looking at second tier as light is different than first tier colors. It's different. But what's interesting is, and I'm going to, so people can see here, I'm going to draw this Venn diagram with my left hand. Let's see how we do here. There we go. Pretty good. Yeah. I am left-handed though. Okay. So, it's hard to stay awake at 5 a.m. Come on. Okay, so, all right. So what we have here, the way I explain this when I'm talking to people about the biblical narrative, is we have our first tier and we have our second tier. And so the question is, how do we get from here to here? And that's at the heart of the biblical narrative. We're going to see that. We're going to see that's at the heart of the biblical narrative. Now, Beck and others would talk about this space being an evolutionary leap, because you are now moving from being a subject of what era you're in to where you can say, wait a minute, these worldviews continue to expand, and I understand that we have a problem in blue. I understand we've got a real problem with orange banking and some of the things that are going on in the financial industry. I understand we got a problem in green because people have taken green and done things with green. Somebody brought up the gender problem, and we talked about that, where they're trying to allow males to compete in female track and those kinds of things because they say they identify that way. Well, those things now can all be looked at objectively without one pulling against the other. The big war in Christianity is blue and green. Progressive Christians versus fundamentalists. There's a lot of stuff you will read on the internet where the progressives really hammer the fundamentalists. Well, it's not to say there isn't unhealthy. I'm no longer identifying myself as a blue being. By the same token, the only reason I'm here talking to you about the biblical narrative is because I grew up learning book, chapter, and verse of that book. Blue. I learned the biblical narrative in blue. It had great value to me. So you don't just throw it out. And you better be careful when you're talking to other people that are still, excuse me, still in that particular worldview and they're a subject of it. You might think to yourself, well, they know not what they do. Okay, that's biblical. But you're moving from first to second. Now, when you are a subject and you are attached to a particular color, one of those spiral circles, each of those worldviews becomes a form. And when I say a form, what I'm saying is that depending upon what denomination you're in first tier, it could be any of them. It could be a blue form, it could be an orange form, or a green form in first tier. And you know that it is when you have someone come in to talk with you for the weekend, and they're, let's say, I'll just take blue again. It's easy to pick on them. Besides fundamentalists, they just don't like to come to my lectures. So I usually can use them. But again, they're a big part of our family, so I don't say that to denigrate. I have to keep emphasizing that. It's not about that. So when they talk about their worldviews that make up their dogma and doctrine and creed, it's a form. It's a blue form. Forms have boundaries. You cannot have a form without boundaries. Boundaries are that which define the form. Where does the pastor, the priest, the whoever, the teacher, run into a problem? When they think outside that form, when they think outside that box, when they violate the form. And the pastor is very upset because the pastor is seeing deeper things in the narrative and is wondering, is there any way, or have you come across other people that have used ways of teaching where I could lead my congregation in a direction more suited to what I'm thinking. Because there's nothing worse than me standing behind that pulpit and trying to deliver a message that stays within that form, that blue form, that orange form, that green form. And they have a real disconnect. There was a survey recently released. It may have been Barna Research Group. They asked 1,000 Protestant pastors, what is your list of 5 biggest problems you face as a pastor? 5 biggest problems. The number one problem dwarfed the next second biggest problem. The number one problem, they said, was apathy. Wow. Now, why is that? Well, if the people who are in the teaching position feel that they're just trying to speak in ways that they know the audience will receive it well, that may not come across with much energy from the pastor themselves or the priest or the whoever. But something's going on, because Pew Research says that when we look at our 18 to 30-year-olds out there, they're not going to church. Very low percentage. That's a trajectory. We all know the story of the frog in the water. So you say, oh, that's a shame. And then you look at how many churches closed last year. I think it was 4,000 some. Buildings were closed and sold. And then the ones that are staying open, especially the more fundamentalists, they have these big buildings. You go on Sunday morning and there's a middle section in the building, and all the people are in the middle section up front, and they're generally my age. Why is that? Because the traditional age passes down and holds the same view generation after generation, until a generation comes along in modernity and starts to question. And once they start to question, they say, I don't see it that way anymore. But before then, nobody questioned. They just received. It's like in the traditional age, if your grandfather was a blacksmith, your father was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith, that's the traditional age. It just perpetuated the same things. So I'm really pointing this out to form because once you get out here in the second tier, you have actually detached from any specific worldview as your identity. You're not blue, you're not green, you're not orange, you're all of it. You recognize that you're all of it, and you recognize the values in all of it. And this will become more and more clear as we go along. Now, when you detach from form, where do you end up? You end up in formlessness, because you no longer identify with a form. You have detached from form, and that is formlessness, and we're going to see that in just a minute, right out of the narrative. It's all over the narrative. Form and formlessness is all over the narrative. And people are like, what are you talking about? Well, that's where I have to go back to the text, and I do. I'm going to go back to the text here in just a little while to give you a flavoring of how this is all working. What's really cool here is when you can use this spiral and you can use this concept of form and formless, it has now allowed me to have conversations with people in Buddhism. They use this language, form, formlessness. That's big in Buddhism. It's big in Hinduism. So now all of a sudden I'm talking to people about the biblical narrative, and I've got a connection point with them. I'm now able to talk to them in a way that I couldn't talk to them when I was attached to Blue Mean. And the point was, you were either a Christian or not. Okay, again, what does that mean? Well, we're going to get to the future of faith tomorrow. And I have to keep saying stuff like that to make sure you come back. Now, so the form and formlessness. Okay, now let's talk about form and formless in this sense. Let's talk about role and function and identity. Role and function and identity. Okay, role and function. I am a husband. I'm a father. I'm a grandfather. I'm president of presence. I am a Caucasian. I am male. Those are roles and functions. Vocational roles, relational roles, biological role. Those are roles and function. But is that my identity? Do I say, yeah, that's my identity? No. My identity is that which comes from source. And what is source? Well, the biblical narrative says God is light. Light? Oh, that sounds like a second tier deal. Light, yeah, second tier. God is light. God is formless. Where are the boundaries of God? Where does God start? Where does God stop? God is the source of my identity. Everything else plays a role and function in my life. What kind of husband I am, what kind of grandfather I am, what kind of worker I am. Those are just roles and functions I play. They're not my identity. People that used to work in factories for 40 years and then their company closed, they went off the deep end because it was their identity. They had identified with a role and function and confused it as their identity. Now this is big when we get to tomorrow, because we're going to talk about identity tomorrow. And we're going to fill in this part tomorrow. And we're going to do it from the biblical narrative. And hopefully, when I'm done with this, it'll clarify more. But is everybody understanding the difference I'm drawing between role and function and identity? That's not who you are. Your true identity comes from. Well, we're all here, faith people believing in God. Where did everything come from? God, including the human. Spirit, identity. Now, what would I use in the narrative? What do I use in the narrative to show these two realms that you have in the spiral of first and second tier, that you have the first tier level seen set in separation against each other, as there's resistance every time a new one comes along by the previous one, until you get out the second tier and you can see, oh no, they're all valuable. And then instead of the colors, we see that light is an example of what it means to be able to integrate, to be integral. And that's another word for second tier, is integral consciousness. That is a whole field in and of itself, and you are not far from the center of where tons of that material are printed, and that's over here in Boulder. And I doubt that you'd be surprised at that. Again, we lived in Colorado Springs. Not so much. Down there. Okay. So now we're talking about what is the biblical narrative really saying about our identity. Not only my identity, what about the identity of people who live all across the globe? And what is the basis of that identity? We said this morning that when you're in blue, the basis of your identity is based on law. Obedient, disobedient, faithful, unfaithful. That's where you stand with your God identity. And it's all based on what you do. Self as source. Is your identity coming from what you do? Question mark. Well, in that regard, I want to look at Paul's long treatise on identity that is in Galatians chapter 4. And I think this will start making a lot more sense. Paul, I think, does a better job than I do of explaining it. I'm going to take this and erase it. Go over here. And so, Paul says, look, let's have a discussion about our identity. And remember, when he's talking to the people in Galatia, he's up against the Jewish followers who are called Judaizers, who are coming out to tell the followers of Jesus, look, you still keep circumcision. You still keep the law. And Paul is saying, no, you're moving into a new identity. Law will still be kept. Why? Because it plays role and function. What's its role and function? Well, you know what its role and function is if you have kids. You give them boundaries. That's what law does. You tell them whether they've been obedient or disobedient. You would probably get in a lot of trouble with the law, however, if you threw them out because they disobeyed. If you tossed your kids, they didn't keep my laws. There's penalties for that, child abuse, etc. However, in religion, the fundamentalist has not had any problem in God doing that to 3/4 of his children. Okay, so we're going to talk about that as we go along as well. What does that mean, and what does that identity mean? So Paul says, okay, let's think about it this way. Let's go all the way back to Father Abraham. Abraham had 2 sons. 2 sons. I'll put that up here. And those 2 sons came from 2 moms. Moms, that's the actual Greek word. So, probably most of you remember the story. Hagar and Sarah, the 2 mothers. And they each have a son. One is Ishmael, the other is Isaac. Paul is using history, developmental history, to say, look what's happened here and why it's happened. And he said, these things are metaphorical for what true identity is. And they involve these 2 mothers, and they involve these 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. So you got Ish, you got Isaac. Now, here's what's interesting. He says, one of these sons was born after the flesh. The other son was born after the spirit. Okay, let's write that down, because Paul talks a lot about flesh and spirit. Flesh belongs over here. This is where we got biology. This is where we got genealogy. Genealogy belongs under forms. What form are you? A Gentile genealogy? From Judah? From whatever. Genealogy has to do with the form of your identity. After the flesh, or Isaac was born after the spirit. So what is he actually saying about these 2 realms that we're talking about here? Well, when Abraham and Sarah did not have a child, Sarah actually suggested to Abraham that he take his handmaiden, Hagar, and help God. Give God a lending hand. She's 90 years old, for Pete's sakes. You know. And so she suggests to Abraham that they have a child through Hagar. Now, Abraham is a model of faith and a hero of faith, and his life and what he went through is a great inspiration to me. But I got to tell you, if your wife says, hey, why don't you have a baby with the handmaiden? Come on, guy. I mean, really? You really think that's going to fly in the long run? So I got to give Abraham a little critique there. But seriously, that's the way it worked in those times, back in that tribal era, back when you had the handmaiden and you had those things and they were accepted, and they later are not going to be accepted. So when Ishmael was born, by whose power was Ishmael born? Abraham's. Abraham's power. To be born after the flesh, to have an identity after the flesh, is to have an identity of self as source. It is what the human does. You know, just like in whether you get it right according to the way you do church and denomination and everything else. It's what you do. He's saying doing is an identity when you are after the flesh and attached to a form of obedient, disobedient, or forms that are determined by law to be you're in, you're out. And so self as source goes all the way back to Adam. Adam was trying to be like God. He wanted through self as source to know what? As you brought up this afternoon today, hey, are you going to test? Yes, she was already there. Adam wanted the knowledge of good and evil. I guess if you had the knowledge of good and evil, you could judge everybody. And you could say, yes, I know all the truth, and this is not of the truth, and so you could grasp the knowledge of good and evil in that sense. Through self as source. So this is self as source. Now Isaac is said to be born after the Spirit. Why? Who was the source of Isaac's birth? God. For God gave life to the deadness of Sarah's womb. It wasn't Abraham. It was the Spirit of God who allowed this lady at 90 years of age to have a child. God as source, Paul says, not self as source. That identity is not coming through self as source. Identity is coming through God as source. That's going to be big as we move into tomorrow. And we fill in this middle part and what goes in there. So what does Paul have to say about form and formless? Okay. Paul says, Hagar also represents Mount Sinai. Oh boy, the law keeps coming up, doesn't it? Moses went up, got the law of the 10 Commandments. Or, if you saw the Mel Brooks movie, he had 15, but he dropped one. So he ended up with 10. So you got Mount Sinai. Well, what's over here? Paul will teach that the deliverer or deliverance comes from Mount Zion. Whose space and what comes from Mount Zion? The deliverer comes from Zion, God. Deliverance comes from Spirit, from God. That's where deliverance comes from. Israel did not deliver herself from bondage. She was delivered by the power of God. There's only one power that exists in the universe, and we all have it, and we're all the same. Now, what we do, what we understand about it, that's different among all of us. And sometimes we do real well, and sometimes we don't do so well. But now we see that Sinai is an actual form. I mean, you can go there. It was an actual geographical form. Where's Mount Zion, where God comes from? It's out here in formlessness. You can't see it with a telescope. You can't go there. It's formlessness. He's contrasting form and formless. He says also as well that this represents the Jerusalem that is now. The Jerusalem that is now, when Paul was writing, was the literal, physical city of Jerusalem. It was a geographical place. It was a form that you could go to. It was a form surrounded by walls that define its geography. It was a form. But Paul says, but we are children of the Jerusalem above. That's called the New Jerusalem. So, what about the New Jerusalem? Is it form or is it formless? I mean, how would you direct somebody to the New Jerusalem, right? New Jerusalem is formlessness. It's God's space. It's spirit space. Its source is spirit. This is human as source. Those are two attempts to have one's identity, Paul says. And when you go back, if you do, into what the Judaizers are saying, you're going back into the law. And when you go back into the Sinai, and you go back into the law, and you go back into the Jerusalem, which is now, you're going back from being born of the Spirit to being born of the self, identifying with the self as source. And so he says about this, and if we look at this Jerusalem above, by the way, when we get out to John's Revelation, he's going to talk about the coming of a new heaven and earth. Okay, you start in Genesis with what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. What were they? Form. You had planets and stars and galaxies, and all that belonged to the realm of form. In the beginning was form. But what about the new heaven and earth? New heaven and earth is a space that is God's space. And in John's Revelation, he says in that space is this new Jerusalem that transcends form. And what happens, says John, in terms of the new Jerusalem? Paul said it was above. John has a vision where he says, and the new Jerusalem has now come down. And the presence of God is with humanity. That's where we get presence, our name. The presence of God is with humanity. Well, what do you mean the presence of God with humanity? Wasn't it always? Not in the realm of form, it wasn't. Why? Because over here you also have temple. Now remember what we said about temple this morning? About how it was a physical structure, a building. A building made with hands. And when Stephen was martyred in Acts chapter 7, he was being stoned to death. It was because one of the things he said was that God doesn't dwell in buildings made with hands. Whoa. You're telling that to a people who says God dwells in the Holy of Holies, and that our high priest goes in there every year with the blood of bulls and goats, and that in that place and in the presence of God, blood sprinkled on the ark, another physical form, is the way we get our forgiveness, and you're telling us, what, God doesn't dwell in buildings made with hands? Didn't come out too well. What was Stephen saying? It's not going to happen in the realm of form. And that's what Paul was saying. When we get to the new heaven and earth out here, that I'll talk about tomorrow, one of the things that John says is this: and I saw no temple there. Interesting. And I saw no temple there. Now, I do share with my fundamentalist friends that he did not say, but I did see a church building. He doesn't say that. What am I saying? Well, it'd be almost like somebody putting on their website, we're a non-church church. Can you believe somebody would say something like that on their website? We're going to talk about that concept of non-church church because it's a good one. So now you see we are moving into this reframing, and that you have a realm of form here. Consciousness forms produce external forms. Form is both external and internal. I used current examples. When we moved into modernity, all of a sudden, people were outwardly making, with modern consciousness, they started making modern furniture. The previous age of traditional, they all had these traditional concepts, and what did they make as an outward form? Traditional furniture. And you know the difference between modern and traditional furniture. You know the same in architecture. Form is both internal and external. And Paul is saying that form plays role and function. It has a role and function. It's okay until you make it your identity. And once you make Sinai and law and circumcision or anything a matter of you got God identity, you don't. And then we decide that each religion sets up its own hierarchy to decide that whether you are inside the boundaries or you're not, then human judgment comes in because it has to, because law requires judgment. You just have to have it. Now, I can say that, of course, I believe in law and raising children, boundaries, yes. But the message at bedtime is you will always be loved and accepted. I don't ever want boundaries to be a condition by which I say I no longer love you and accept you. They may leave, they may do whatever. They could end up in prison. Well, then, of course, I know some people in Kansas City that do a marvelous job of prison ministry. And what they do is they go in those prisons and they tell the people behind those bars, you are already in bondage, and that's what got you here in an outward manifested form of bars, is you were in bondage, and that's what led you here in the first place. But you can be free for the rest of your life, even if you're behind the form of bars, and you never leave them because of whatever you did, okay? Okay, now we're starting to really see the impact of love and acceptance and what its basis is. What is the basis of it? Where does the guilt come from? That's a good question. Where does it come from? And in some cases, it's because we can't forgive ourselves because we're identified with systems that are more doing-oriented than spirit-oriented. Let me keep an eye on this because we're only going, oh boy, we're only going an hour tonight, and I'm getting hungry. I don't know about you guys. So, here we see the differences between these two things. This is role and function. This all played a role and function. All the first tier played a role and function. But identity is when you get out here to integral or integrated thinking and you see the oneness of all things. Tim had brought up, and I'm just going to do this quickly before I wrap it up tonight. Tim had brought up, for example, quantum science. So let me go there for a minute because I'm having these conversations right now with people who are in quantum science and who believe absolutely in spirituality. Now, they will define spirituality in a lot of diverse ways. What's one of the fastest growing movements in our country? Spiritual but not religious, right? SBNRs. Or another title is Nones, N-O-N-E-S. The Nones. They're not affiliated. So, something's happening out there, right? Something's going on. Now we can say, well, yeah, it's because this world's going to hell in a handbasket. The younger generation. Okay. All right, that's a view. My view is that these worldview consciousnesses of inclusion among the young people is growing, and they're having a real hard time with separation paradigms where you're either okay or you're not okay, you're either loved or you're not loved, and they're having a real problem with that. And I'm saying Paul had a real problem with it too. We're going to talk about that more tomorrow. But let's do science. How does science start? We all know. Some guy got hit in the head with an apple. Okay. Not too pizzazz or whatever. Newton. Okay, we now have science that's Newtonian. What is Newtonian all about? It's about space and time, all of which is determined by the speed of light. All of it's determined by the speed of light. And so all of this is measurable. This is all measurable because it's form-based. These are all forms. And so you're just measuring how far away is this planet? How long did it take light to travel from this part of the universe to the other part of the universe? Everything in Newtonian physics for the longest time was measuring the external form of the universe. Form. Okay, now I'm going to put this in tonight, but tomorrow will be something different. Then comes along these people in quantum physics. And one of these people was a guy named David Bohm, B-O-H-M. He was a contemporary of Einstein. And he started doing experiments and doing these calculus formulas. And he said that actually if you look at something like a rock that seems to be, in caveman science, good for bashing somebody's head in, it's just a rock. If you start looking at that rock and you go deeper, it's like, oh, wait a minute, it's made of molecules. Oh, wait a minute. I keep going and it's made of these things called quarks, which is actually waves, and it's headed toward nothingness. What we thought was a firm form that could be measured is giving us something surprising. So what happens in quantum? Bohm discovers non-locality. What is non-locality? It's when he could prove that you could charge two particles simultaneously and extend them 100 light years away from each other and give a single stimulus related to both, and they'll both react at the same time hundreds of light years away. That is a proven fact in quantum physics. It's called non-locality because I watch Nova. Yeah, I do the cheat codes, man. I'm not going to read all that formula stuff. So, what is non-locality? Einstein said he called this spooky science. And he set out to disprove Bohm's work. This is impossible. I did theory of relativity, for Pete's sakes. I know how all this works. But when he began to do it, he finally came around to the fact that Bohm had hit on something, that there's something that transcends space and time. Whoa. And here's the thing. It's not separate from this. It's this on a deeper and deeper level. And what is it pointing to? It's pointing to something that Bohm called an implicate order, which is formless. And he suddenly became spiritual in the last days of his life, where he was convinced that there was an implicate order that was responsible for the explicate order. And so what is this up here? We got form, we got formless. Tomorrow, here's what we're going to talk about. What goes in here is transform. That's what quantum is. It's transform because it goes beyond, it's transcending form, and it's pointing to something beyond form, which would be formless. So, those are concepts that are all coming together. But where does the rubber really meet the road? As I end this all tonight and get ready for the big finale tomorrow. in the biblical narrative. Here's what I'm leaving you with. What is transformed? What goes in transform? We have the Old Testament, we have all these things in the realm of form, and we have over here God and Spirit. How do we get from here to here? Through transform.
Renew your mind.
Say again.
Renew your mind.
Renew your mind. Now that is, be not conformed, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's a consciousness issue. What is it that points out and reveals that consciousness? Tomorrow we're going to look at the 2,000-year-old Gordian knot. Christology. Now, I'm going to propose something that if you follow presence, you love this. If you don't follow presence, you might not like it at all. But it's Sunday and I'll be done and you'll be done with me, and so you won't have to listen to this anymore. We're finished. But now here's the kicker. What am I getting at? Form and transform fall under this realm right here. And that's role and function. But identity is out here. I don't have Christology as identity. What does that mean? We'll find out tomorrow. You have to come back.